Night presses gently against the windows of a Paris studio. The lamps are low. Shadows pool in the corners like quiet water. In the center of the room stands a canvas so large it feels less like a painting and more like a wall torn from a collapsing world. It is grey. Only grey. No comforting color. No softness. A horse screams without sound. A mother lifts a lifeless child. A bull watches, ancient and unblinking. Limbs are broken into sharp angles. Faces split like shattered glass. Nothing here rests. Nothing here heals. Outside, in 1937, a town in Spain has been bombed. Smoke, fire, dust. Inside, a man stands alone with a brush, not painting what he sees, but what humanity feels when the sky itself turns violent. He does not search for beauty. He searches for truth, even when truth is jagged. This is Guernica, and the mind behind it did something no artist had done before. He broke the world apart. Faces, bodies, space, time, and rebuilt it in fragments, as if reality itself were a puzzle only he could see clearly. But how does a human being learn to look at the world this way? What kind of childhood teaches the eye to fracture form, and the heart to carry so much weight? Tonight, we step softly into the life of Pablo Picasso, not the legend, but the man, the boy, the restless mind who changed how humanity sees. If you enjoy calm, immersive journeys through history and the lives that shaped our world, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Your quiet support helps these stories continue. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Learned to See. Pablo Ruiz Picasso was born on October 25, 1881, in Málaga, Spain, a coastal city shaped by Mediterranean light, Catholic ritual, and the steady rhythm of southern life. Whitewashed buildings reflected the sun. Church bells marked the hours. Markets, bull rings, and family gatherings structured daily existence. It was a world rich in color and movement, and into it was born a child who would spend his life learning how to see differently. Unlike many artists whose early talent emerges against resistance, Picasso grew up in a household where art was both respected and practiced. His father, José Ruiz Blasco, was a trained painter and instructor at the School of Fine Arts. He specialized in realistic depictions of birds, particularly pigeons, rendered with academic precision. The discipline of drawing, proportion, anatomy, shadow, was not foreign to the household. It was routine. From an early age, Pablo demonstrated unusual technical ability. Family accounts describe him drawing before he could write fluently. By the age of 7, he was already receiving formal instruction from his father. Exercises were not playful improvisations, but structured academic studies. Plaster casts, live models, careful observation. The foundations of realism were laid early and rigorously. In 1891, when Picasso was 9, the family moved to La Coruña, where his father accepted a teaching position. The northern climate was colder, more austere than Malaga, and the change marked the boy's first experience of relocation, a pattern that would continue throughout his life. It was there that he produced some of his earliest surviving works, already demonstrating control beyond his years. Illness occasionally kept him indoors, and like many studious children, he spent long periods drawing. But solitude was not abandonment. His family remained supportive, attentive to his development. His mother, Maria Picasso Lopez, believed firmly in his potential and encouraged his ambition. Spain itself offered powerful visual impressions. Religious iconography, solemn Madonnas, dramatic saints, filled churches. Bullfighting, with its theatrical choreography of danger and spectacle, left strong visual memories. These were not yet themes of interpretation. They were experiences stored in the mind of a young observer. By the mid-1890s, it became clear that Pablo's technical skill had surpassed that of many adult students. A well-known family anecdote recounts that his father, recognizing his son's superior ability, symbolically handed over his brushes. Whether embellished over time or not, the story reflects a truth. Picasso's training had advanced rapidly, and expectations for him had grown accordingly. Before Paris, before Cubism, before revolution in art, there was simply a disciplined Spanish boy, trained in academic realism, absorbing the world around him with careful attention, building the visual language that he would one day dismantle and reconstruct entirely. Chapter 2: When Art Became a Language. As Pablo grew, talent was no longer something charming. It became undeniable. His father, both proud and exacting, took charge of his training with academic seriousness. Drawing was no longer a pastime. It was discipline. Lines had to be precise. Shadows had to obey light. Form had to respect anatomy. Under this structure, the boy learned the rules of representation the way a musician learns scales, not to remain inside them forever, but to understand their logic. The family moved often, first to A Coruña in northern Spain, later to Barcelona, each relocation widening the young artist's world. In Barcelona, he entered the School of Fine Arts at an age when most students were years older. He passed the entrance exam in record time, completing technical exercises meant to take weeks in a matter of days. Teachers recognized not only skill, but focus, an intensity that bordered on obsession. Yet classrooms were only part of his education. Barcelona at the end of the 19th century pulsed with intellectual restlessness. Cafes filled with poets, painters, political thinkers, and dreamers. Smoke curled in the air as voices debated modernity, symbolism, philosophy, and the future of Spain. Pablo listened more than he spoke. Here, art was not simply craft, it was thought made visible. Soon, Madrid called. At the Royal Academy of San Fernando, he encountered Spain's artistic past not through textbooks, but through direct confrontation with the masters. He spent long hours at the Prado Museum, standing before Velázquez, Goya, El Greco. These painters did not merely copy reality, they bent it. El Greco stretched bodies towards heaven. Goya exposed madness and fear beneath society's surface. Velázquez played with perspective and presence, asking the viewer to question what is seen. For the young Picasso, this was a revelation. Reality, he began to understand, was not fixed. A painting did not have to be a window. It could be a mind. The world on canvas could shift, distort, intensify, and in doing so, become more truthful than a perfect imitation. At the same time, he grew restless with rigid academic routines. Formal lessons felt slow, repetitive. He skipped classes, choosing instead to wander streets, sketch strangers, and observe life directly. Beggars, workers, performers, old faces lined with time. These interested him more than idealized models. Human presence, with all its imperfection, became his true subject. Art was no longer about proving skill. It was becoming a way to think, to question, to interpret existence itself. The young student began to sense that the visible world was only a starting point. Beneath it lay emotion, memory, structure, layers waiting to be uncovered. He had learned the rules well. Quietly, almost without announcing it, he was beginning to imagine how they might be broken. Chapter 3: Paris, Loss, and the Turning Inward. When Pablo Picasso began traveling regularly to Paris around 1900, he entered a city that stood at the center of the modern art world. For young artists across Europe, Paris was both promise and test. Studios crowded with ambition, cafes thick with debate, galleries deciding reputations. Picasso did not arrive as a celebrated figure, but neither was he entirely alone or unsupported. He was one of many young painters trying to find direction in a competitive, fast-moving cultural capital. He lived in Montmartre, the bohemian quarter where artists, writers, and performers gathered. Conditions could be uncomfortable: cold rooms, shared spaces, irregular meals. But this was the common life of the avant-garde, rather than extreme destitution. Poverty existed, yet it was intertwined with artistic community, conversation, and the shared belief that new art could be born from these modest surroundings. During this period, Picasso moved between Spain and France, still connected to his homeland while absorbing Parisian influences. He visited exhibitions, studied the work of Toulouse-Lautrec, Degas, and other modern painters, and observed urban life closely. The city presented contrasts: entertainment beside hardship, spectacle beside isolation. A decisive emotional rupture came in 1901 with the death of his close friend Carlos Casagemas, a painter and poet who died by suicide in Paris after a period of emotional distress. The event affected Picasso deeply. In the months that followed, his work shifted in tone and subject matter. Melancholic figures, beggars, blind men, mothers with children, solitary individuals, began to dominate his canvases. This was not simply sadness translated into paint. It marked the beginning of what would later be called his blue period. Cool tones, elongated forms, and restrained compositions conveyed introspection and human vulnerability. Rather than focusing on technical display, Picasso directed attention toward emotional atmosphere. At the same time, he stood between artistic languages. His academic training had given him mastery of realism, but Paris exposed him to modern experimentation. The question was no longer whether he could paint well in the traditional sense, but what he wanted painting to do. In small studios, often working intensely and quickly, he began trusting his own direction. Grief, observation, and environment converged. The young painter who had mastered academic rules was starting to bend them, not yet to break art apart, but to allow feeling, mood, and psychological presence to lead. Here, in Paris, shaped by friendship, loss, and the search for independence, Picasso's identity as a modern artist began to take clear form. Chapter 4: The Color of Sorrow. In the early years of the new century, something in Picasso's work shifted so clearly that even those who did not understand it could feel the change. The brightness of youth faded from his canvases. Warm tones drained away. In their place came a quiet, unbroken tide of blue. It was not decorative blue, nor the blue of summer sky. It was the color of evening shadows, of cold rooms, of distance. The emotional weight he had carried since Casamamus's death now found a visual language. Figures grew thin, elongated, wrapped in stillness. Eyes lowered, hands folded, bodies turned inward as if guarding private grief. One of the works from this period, often discussed among critics and viewers alike, shows a blind musician hunched over a guitar, bones sharp beneath skin, the world reduced to touch and sound. Another painting presents two figures locked in a silent exchange of sorrow, their forms simplified, almost sculptural in their heaviness. These images did not shout. They lingered, asking the viewer to sit with discomfort. Paris was not sure what to make of it. At a time when many artists chased color, light, and pleasure, Picasso offered solitude. Gallery visitors paused, unsettled. Some dismissed the works as morbid. Others felt, perhaps uncomfortably, that the paintings mirrored something they recognized but rarely named: the loneliness beneath city life, the quiet fatigue of survival. Yet this was the first moment when Picasso's art became unmistakably his own. No longer a student of tradition, he had entered a deeply personal terrain. The technical mastery remained, but it served emotion now, not display. Backgrounds flattened, details disappeared. What mattered was presence, the psychological weight of a human being simply existing. He was not yet celebrated. Money remained scarce, but a small circle of viewers began to notice the coherence of his vision. These were not random, sad pictures. They formed a world, consistent and sincere, shaped by empathy rather than spectacle. For Picasso, this period marked an important realization. Art did not need to please to be true. It could confront. It could hold sorrow without resolving it. In choosing blue, again and again, he declared that inner experience, even the painful parts, deserved a place on canvas. The young painter who had once studied posture and gesture now used them to reveal invisible burdens. And though the world had not yet caught up, a distinct artistic voice had stepped into the light, quiet, somber, and impossible to ignore. Chapter 5. A Softer Light, a Changing World. As the weight of the blue period slowly eased, a gentler warmth began to enter Picasso's paintings. The deep, unbroken blues gave way to muted pinks, ochres, and soft earth tones. The emotional world did not become cheerful, but it shifted, like dawn after a long night. Sorrow remained, yet it was joined by tenderness, fragility, and a quiet sense of human connection. This phase, later called the Rose Period, found its subjects not in city streets, but among traveling performers, acrobats, harlequins, circus families. These were people who lived on the margins, always moving, never fully belonging. Picasso seemed drawn to them not for spectacle, but for what they represented: lives balanced between performance and vulnerability. He painted slender figures in simple costumes, standing together yet somehow alone. Their gestures were restrained, their expressions thoughtful. Even in groups, there was a gentle emotional distance between them, as if each carried an inner world unseen by others. The circus, often associated with noise and laughter, became in his hands a place of quiet introspection. Technically, His style was simplifying. Backgrounds grew sparse, space flattened. Forms became more solid, almost sculptural, as though he were carving figures from color rather than modeling them with light. The human body interested him less as anatomy and more as structure, shapes in balance, volumes in relation. This was not yet the radical break that would come later, but the foundation was being laid. Picasso was learning to reduce, to remove the unnecessary, to search for the essential presence of a figure rather than its surface detail. Socially, he was becoming more connected within Paris's artistic circles. Friendships formed with writers, poets, and fellow painters who questioned tradition and searched for new visual languages. Discussions stretched late into the night about symbolism, modern life, African sculpture, and the possibility that Western art had grown too comfortable. Something was building. The Rose period may appear gentle on the surface, but beneath it lay a quiet preparation. Picasso was stepping away from emotional narrative toward formal exploration. Color, line, and shape were beginning to carry as much meaning as subject matter. The sadness of blue had taught him depth. Now, in softer tones, he explored balance. Soon, even these figures, these delicate performers suspended in stillness, would begin to shift. Their bodies no longer whole, their forms no longer stable. The world of appearances was slowly loosening, and Picasso, watchful as ever, was ready to pull it apart.
Chapter 6. When Painting Became Dangerous. As Picasso's work moved further from traditional representation, unease began to ripple through the art world. Until now, innovation had meant new subjects, new moods, perhaps new techniques. But the underlying agreement remained. A painting should resemble the visible world. Picasso was beginning to question that agreement itself. In Paris, museums still upheld classical ideals: harmony, proportion, perspective carefully constructed to imitate how the eye sees. Yet in studios and cafes, younger artists whispered about something else: the feeling that reality was not as stable as it appeared. Science spoke of unseen forces. Cities moved faster. Photography could now capture likeness effortlessly. If a machine could copy the surface of the world, what, then, was painting for? Picasso's answer unsettled many. His figures were growing more simplified, more structural. Faces seemed mask-like. Bodies felt less like flesh and more like assembled forms. Depth flattened. Space no longer behaved naturally. Viewers searching for comfort found tension instead. Some critics accused modern artists of abandoning beauty. Others called the work primitive, even barbaric. African and Iberian sculptures, which Picasso and his peers studied with fascination, were dismissed by traditionalists as crude. Yet to Picasso, they held a directness, a symbolic force Western art had lost. He was not trying to imitate these objects. He was absorbing their freedom from illusion. This period marked a cultural friction larger than one painter. Europe stood at the edge of modernity, industry expanding, old hierarchies trembling, philosophies shifting. Art, too, was shedding certainty. To many observers, Picasso's direction felt like destruction rather than evolution. But for him, this was not rebellion for its own sake. It was inquiry. He was asking whether a painting could show not just how something looks, but how it exists in space, how it is understood in the mind. Could multiple viewpoints live at once? Could form be analyzed rather than merely described? These questions made his work feel intellectual, even cold to some. The emotional blue figures and gentle circus performers were giving way to something sharper, more conceptual. The human figure, once a vessel of feeling, was becoming a structure to be examined. Friends supported him. Others kept distance. Yet Picasso rarely defended himself publicly. He continued working as if the argument itself belonged on the canvas, not in words. Art was no longer only expressive. It was becoming investigative, almost scientific. And in turning painting into a tool for dissecting reality, Picasso crossed a threshold. From here on, what he created would not just challenge taste. It would challenge how people believed the world itself should be seen.
Chapter 7. Love, Control, and the Cost of Intensity. As Picasso's artistic experiments grew more radical, his personal relationships became equally charged. Love, for him, was rarely gentle or simple. It arrived with intensity and often left traces of imbalance. In the early 1900s, during his years in Montmartre, he formed a long relationship with Fernande Olivier, who shared his bohemian life in the Bateau Lavoir studios. She witnessed the transition from the blue and rose periods into the beginnings of Cubism. Poverty, ambition, and artistic rivalry surrounded them. Stability existed for a time, but it was fragile. Picasso's focus on work was absolute, and emotional equilibrium rarely lasted. Even in companionship, he remained inwardly driven. Later came Olga Khokhlova, a Russian ballerina whom he married in 1918. The marriage marked a visible shift toward social respectability. Picasso entered Parisian high society, dressing formally, attending events, moving in elite circles. His paintings during this period often returned to neoclassical solidity, monumental figures, calm compositions, controlled lines. Yet beneath the surface, tension grew. Olga valued structure, decorum, predictability. Picasso resisted constraint, whether artistic or domestic. Their separation in the 1930s was bitter, though they never formally divorced, a legal tie that remained long after emotional bonds had fractured. With Marie-Thérèse Walter, whom he met when she was very young, a different dynamic emerged, one marked by secrecy, sensuality, and softness. Her presence coincided with luminous colors and rounded forms. The mood of his canvases lightened. Yet even here, imbalance lingered. The relationship unfolded partly in shadow, existing alongside his marriage. Dora Maar entered his life during the turbulent 1930s, intellectually formidable, politically aware, emotionally complex. A photographer and artist in her own right, she documented the creation of Guernica. During this period, Picasso's portraits of her grew angular, fractured, intense. Tears appear repeatedly in her painted image, not as literal transcription, but as emotional symbol. Critics have long debated whether these distortions reflected empathy, projection, or domination. What is clear is that emotion and power were never separate in his intimate life. Observers and biographers have noted that Picasso could be magnetic, attentive, capable of deep fascination, yet also possessive and controlling. His creative energy structured daily existence. The studio was the center of gravity. Those close to him often found themselves drawn into its orbit, their identities partially absorbed into the evolving mythology of the artist. Several former partners later described emotional environments where admiration was expected and independence complicated. Control, for Picasso, may have functioned as both psychological anchor and artistic method. On canvas, he dismantled and reconstructed reality.
In life,
He often shaped circumstances according to his needs, moving households, altering routines, redefining attachments when momentum shifted. Permanence unsettled him. Transformation felt natural. Yet it would be reductive to view these relationships only through imbalance. They undeniably fueled artistic evolution. Picasso did not compartmentalize experience. Emotional shifts translated visually into curvature or fracture, serenity or distortion. His paintings from different relationships do not merely portray women, they register atmosphere. Harmony softened forms. Conflict sharpened them. Recognition continued to expand during these decades, but inward restlessness remained constant. Each artistic breakthrough led not to stillness, but to further experimentation. Reinvention was not calculated strategy, it was instinctive propulsion. In love, as in art, Picasso resisted stasis. Attachment inspired him, yet permanence suggested confinement. The figures he painted during these years, tender, monumental, shattered, abstracted, reflect not simple romance, but the complex intersection of desire, power, vulnerability, and relentless creative drive. Behind the innovations that reshaped modern art stood a man whose emotional intensity carried cost, not only for those around him, but for himself. The same force that fractured form on canvas made lasting equilibrium difficult. Creation demanded motion, and motion rarely leaves hearts untouched. Chapter 8: Breaking the World Apart. In 1907, inside a crowded studio in Montmartre's Bateau-Lavoir, surrounded by sketches, discarded studies, and restless revisions, Picasso reached a decisive turning point. For years, he had been simplifying forms, flattening space, questioning inherited rules. Now the pressure of those questions demanded a rupture rather than a refinement. The result was a large and deeply unsettling canvas, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. 5 female figures occupy the surface, but occupy is almost the wrong word. They do not sit within space, they press against it. Bodies are angular, faces resemble carved masks. Perspective does not guide the eye backward, it collapses forward in sharp planes. The painting offers no soft entry point, no gradual illusion. It confronts the viewer with raw presence. Even Picasso's closest circle reacted with shock. When shown privately in his studio, the work disturbed many of them. Henri Matisse saw it as aggressive. Georges Braque, who would later become Picasso's key collaborator, was initially unsettled. The painting was not publicly exhibited at the time. Its radicalism exceeded what the art world was ready to accept. Yet the rupture was not chaos. It was investigation. Picasso had been studying Iberian sculpture, whose stylized faces reduced natural detail to structural clarity. He had also encountered African masks and sculpture in Parisian collections and shops, objects that treated the human face not as likeness, but as expressive structure. Combined with Cézanne's idea that nature could be understood through underlying geometric order, these influences converged. The question driving him was fundamental. When we see a person, do we truly perceive them from one fixed viewpoint? Or does perception gather fragments, profile, front, memory, emotional response, into a single mental image? In Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Picasso placed those fragments side by side. Multiple viewpoints coexist. Forms are not described, they are constructed. The painting stands at the threshold of what would soon develop, in dialogue with Braque, into Cubism. Here, representation shifted from imitation to analysis. Objects and bodies could be broken into planes, examined and reassembled according to conceptual logic rather than optical illusion. The canvas became not a window, but a surface where perception itself was tested. This was the breakthrough toward which his earlier periods had quietly led. The emotional restraint of blue, the structural simplification of rose, the study of archaic forms, all converged in this act of dismantling. Painting was no longer obliged to mirror the visible world. It could now question how that world is understood. And once that question had been asked, art could not return unchanged.
Chapter 9. Between Shock and Recognition. When Picasso's new direction entered the world, it did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with confusion. Visitors who had once puzzled over his blue figures now faced something even less familiar. In these new works, objects seemed taken apart and rearranged. A guitar might unfold into interlocking planes. A face could appear both in profile and from the front. Tables tilted. Space fractured. The eye searched for stability and found none. Many viewers felt excluded, as if a private code were being spoken without translation. Critics questioned whether such paintings were finished at all. Some dismissed them as intellectual games, others as a deliberate attack on tradition. The expectation that art should imitate nature was still strong, and Picasso's canvases seemed to deny that obligation entirely. Yet within a smaller circle, a different response grew. Fellow artists recognized the seriousness of the inquiry. They saw not chaos, but structure, a new grammar forming. Among them was Georges Braque, whose parallel explorations would deepen this analytical approach. Together they worked almost like researchers, reducing objects to volumes, studying how forms relate in space. Their studios became laboratories of perception. Collectors, too, slowly began to pay attention. A few individuals sensed that something historic was unfolding, even if they could not fully explain it. Support came quietly, not from mass approval, but from select patrons willing to trust the direction of modern art's uncertain path. For Picasso himself, this period brought a peculiar balance of isolation and validation. Public acceptance lagged behind, but internally, he felt clarity. He was no longer searching blindly. He had found a method that matched his restless mind. Each painting posed a problem. Each solution led to another question. Daily life remained modest. Fame, in the grand sense, had not yet arrived. But among those shaping the future of art, his position was becoming central. Conversations increasingly revolved around the radical shift he had helped initiate. Recognition, when it comes slowly, has a different texture than sudden celebrity. It builds like dawn. First a faint light, then a growing awareness that night is ending. Picasso stood in that early light, not yet fully visible to the world, but impossible to overlook among those watching closely. The shock of his work had not faded. It had become its strength. And as understanding began to follow bewilderment, the language he helped invent started to take root, preparing to reshape the visual world far beyond his studio walls.
Chapter 10. Fame outside, restlessness within. As the years moved forward, Picasso's position in the modern art world grew increasingly secure. His innovations were no longer isolated experiments whispered about in studios. They had become central to conversations about the future of painting. Exhibitions spread his reputation beyond Paris. His name began to travel across Europe, across oceans, attached to the idea of radical change. Yet outer recognition did not bring inner stillness. Success introduced new pressures. Collectors sought his work. Dealers negotiated. Expectations formed around what a Picasso should be. But he resisted repetition. Each time the public began to understand one phase, he felt compelled to move elsewhere. To stay would mean becoming predictable, and predictability felt like artistic death. The world itself was also shifting. Europe moved towards instability, political tensions tightening like wires drawn too taut. The optimism of early modernism gave way to unease. Picasso absorbed this atmosphere indirectly. He was never a distant observer of his time. Though not aligned with a single political voice in these years, he sensed the growing fracture in society, a mood not unlike the visual fragmentation he had already explored on canvas. In his personal life, complexity deepened. Relationships overlapped, evolved, ended. Studios changed. Circles of friends expanded and contracted. He remained magnetic, but also difficult to anchor. Those close to him felt both the warmth of his attention and the pull of his inward focus. Art continued to take precedence over order. His work, too, showed this tension between outer mastery and inner searching. Having broken form apart through Cubism, he began moving more fluidly between styles, sometimes returning to more recognizable figures, other times pushing abstraction further. To outsiders, these shifts could seem inconsistent. For Picasso, they were necessary motion, like breathing. Fame illuminated him, but it did not define him. Inside, he remained the boy who observed, questioned, and quietly doubted the stability of appearances. The difference now was scale. His private inquiries echoed through galleries, influencing artists he had never met. Recognition had arrived, but peace had not. The world saw a pioneer. He felt, still, like a mind in motion, aware that every breakthrough only opened another unknown space to explore.
Chapter 11. War reaches the studio. As the 1930s advanced, the political tensions gathering across Europe broke into violence. For Picasso, the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, was not distant news. Though he had lived in France for decades, Spain remained central to his identity. The land of his childhood, Málaga light, Catholic ritual, bull rings, memory, now appeared in reports of bombardment, division, and loss. In 1936, the Republican government appointed Picasso honorary director of the Prado Museum. The title carried little administrative duty, yet it symbolized something deeper, a recognition that he was now one of Spain's cultural guardians. While the country fractured, its artistic heritage stood vulnerable. War was no longer abstraction. It touched history, art, and memory at once. Paris, where he lived, vibrated with argument. Fascism rose in Germany and Italy. Refugees crossed borders. Intellectuals debated responsibility. Picasso did not fight on a battlefield, but he understood that neutrality was narrowing. In early 1937, he accepted a commission from the Spanish Republican government to create a large mural for the Spanish pavilion at the Paris International Exposition. At first, ideas came slowly. Sketches filled notebooks. Bulls, studio scenes, fragmented figures, yet none resolved into a unified statement. Then, on April 26, 1937, the Basque town of Guernica was bombed by German and Italian aircraft supporting General Franco's nationalist forces. Civilians were killed, buildings burned. The attack shocked Europe. It was a modern aerial assault directed at a civilian population. The news reached Picasso within days. Witnesses recalled that his demeanor shifted. Sleep grew irregular. The studio on the Rue des Grands Augustins became a space of relentless work. Beginning in May 1937, he started the vast canvas that would become Guernica. Dora Maar photographed the painting at multiple stages, documenting its evolution, an unusual visual record of creation under pressure. The composition expanded across more than 7 meters. He chose a stark monochrome palette, blacks, whites, and grays, echoing newspaper photographs and stripping away decorative color. Figures emerged: a screaming horse pierced by a spear, a mother holding her dead child, a fallen warrior, a bull standing impassive, a figure trapped in flames, an electric bulb shaped like an unblinking eye. The imagery resisted literal explanation. Was the bull brutality? Spain itself? Endurance? Was the horse the people? The violence of mechanized war? Picasso refused definitive answers. He constructed a visual language of anguish rather than narrative clarity. Fragmentation returned, not as aesthetic experiment, but as emotional structure. Bodies were broken because the world was breaking. Light in the painting feels harsh, interrogative, not warm illumination, but exposure. The bulb at the center casts a cold glare, as if modern technology itself has become witness and weapon. When Guernica was unveiled at the Paris Exposition in July 1937, reactions were mixed. Some viewers struggled with its abstraction. Others sensed its power immediately. It did not console, it confronted. The mural traveled internationally afterward, raising awareness and funds for the Republican cause. Years later, during the Nazi occupation of Paris, a German officer reportedly saw a reproduction of Guernica in Picasso's apartment and asked, "Did you do this?" Picasso is said to have replied, "No, you did." Whether apocryphal or not, the story captures the painting's transformation from artwork into accusation. For decades, Guernica would remain outside Spain at Picasso's insistence until democratic rule returned. The canvas had become more than an image. It was a political and moral statement tied to historical justice. The long years of experimentation had prepared him for this moment. The fractured planes of Cubism, the emotional depth of the Blue Period, the symbolic intensity of earlier works, all converged. Art shifted from exploration to necessity. In the studio light of 1937, Picasso did not merely innovate. He bore witness. The man who once broke form to question perception now broke it to confront violence. And in doing so, he stepped beyond stylistic revolution into something rarer, the role of artist as chronicler of a century's fracture.
Chapter 12. After the Revolution, Art Moves West. By the mid-20th century, the artistic earthquake Picasso had helped unleash no longer felt like disruption. It had become history. Cubism, once dismissed as incomprehensible, was now taught in academies, catalogued by museums, and absorbed into the structural language of modern art. The rebellion had entered the institution. But art, like history, does not pause once a revolution succeeds. After the Second World War, the cultural center that had long rested in Paris began shifting across the Atlantic. Europe was physically and psychologically scarred. Meanwhile, New York rose as a new capital of modern art, supported by galleries, collectors, and émigré intellectuals. A younger generation emerged, marked by war, exile, and existential uncertainty. Artists such as Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Mark Rothko developed what became known as abstract expressionism, expansive, gestural, emotionally charged painting that often abandoned recognizable imagery. The canvas became an arena of action rather than representation. Picasso observed this transformation from France. He remained internationally celebrated and fiercely productive, yet he was no longer the epicenter of innovation. Younger artists admired him deeply. Pollock studied his work intensely, but admiration carried a burden. To establish themselves, they had to move beyond him. Picasso had opened the door to the fragmentation of form. They stepped through it toward pure gesture and psychological abstraction. His relationship to contemporary movements remained complex. The Surrealists, led by André Breton, respected his imaginative freedom and occasionally claimed him as kin. Yet Picasso resisted formal affiliation. He distrusted manifestos, preferring instinct over doctrine. Even as abstraction advanced, he rarely abandoned the human figure. Faces, bodies, mythological beings, and animals continued to populate his work, suggesting that, for him, the human presence remained central to meaning. Politically, the post-war years marked a visible declaration. In 1944, Picasso joined the French Communist Party, aligning himself publicly with leftist politics after the defeat of fascism. The decision reflected long-held sympathies and a belief that the artist existed within society, not above it. His political stance reinforced his image as a figure engaged with contemporary reality, rather than isolated in aestheticism. By the 1950s, Picasso occupied a rare and paradoxical position. He was both living master and historical monument. Major retrospectives framed his career in stages, as though the story were already complete. Museums competed for his work. Critics wrote about him with the tone usually reserved for the past. Yet Picasso refused to behave like a finished chapter. In the town of Vallauris, he plunged into ceramics, treating clay not as craft, but as sculptural experiment. Plates became faces. Jugs transformed into animals. He expanded his work in sculpture, printmaking, and linocuts, moving rapidly between media. He also turned toward dialogue with the past, reinterpreting masterpieces by Velázquez, Manet, and Delacroix, not as homage, but as re-examination, breaking classical compositions apart and rebuilding them in his own language. This restless productivity carried psychological undertones. To be revolutionary is to stand at the edge of the present. To become canonized is to risk being fixed in time. Picasso's response was motion. He did not attempt to outpace younger movements on their terms. Instead, he followed his own internal rhythm, shifting styles abruptly, revisiting earlier approaches, allowing inconsistency to become a form of freedom. The current of art history flowed onward, toward abstraction, minimalism, conceptual practice. Picasso neither tried to dam the river nor chase its newest currents. He moved within it, sometimes alongside, sometimes against, guided less by trends than by necessity to continue. The world he had helped transform was evolving beyond him. Yet he remained at work daily, brush in hand, refusing stillness. Even as history advanced into new chapters, he insisted on writing his own, proof that creation, for him, was not a phase of youth, but a condition of being. Chapter 13. Lines of Memory, Shadows of Time. In the later decades of his life, Picasso's work did not quiet, but its tone deepened. The fierce analytical dissection of early Cubism softened into something more fluid, more personal. Lines grew freer, sometimes almost playful, yet beneath the surface lay a strong awareness of time's passage. He painted variations on old masters, Velázquez, Manet, Delacroix, not as imitation, but as conversation across centuries. Figures from art history reappeared through his hand, simplified, exaggerated, transformed. It was as though he were walking through a vast memory, revisiting the rooms that had shaped him, rearranging their contents. Faces in these late works often seemed mask-like again, but now with a different mood. Not the confrontational force of his early radical years, but a blend of humor, melancholy, and reflection. Eyes wide, features bold, bodies outlined with confident, almost childlike clarity. The hand moved quickly, decisively, as if urgency had replaced deliberation. There was also an increase in intimacy. Couples, artists with models, figures seated in quiet interiors, scenes of closeness tinged with solitude. The human form remained central, but it carried the imprint of decades of looking, loving, losing. These were not studies of structure alone. They were records of lived experience. Printmaking and ceramics occupied him as well, offering tactile immediacy. Clay under the hands, ink pressed into paper, processes direct and physical. Even in advanced age, his productivity astonished those around him. Creation seemed less a choice than a condition of being. Yet a certain darkness drifted at the edges. Time had narrowed possibilities. Friends had died. The century he had traveled through bore scars of war and upheaval. Though he did not retreat into silence, a reflective undertone colored his output, an awareness that the artist, like the century, had crossed into its final chapters. These late works were not quiet in appearance, but they held stillness beneath movement. They felt like conversations with memory, gestures made not to shock the world, but to remain in dialogue with it for as long as the hand could move. Chapter 14. The Studio by the Sea. In his later years, Picasso's world grew geographically smaller, even as his inner life remained vast. He settled in the south of France, where light fell differently than in Paris, softer, warmer, stretched across sea and stone. The Mediterranean landscape, with its pale skies and slow horizons, offered a kind of quiet continuity, a rhythm removed from the urgency of earlier decades. His homes, large, filled with works in progress, objects, sculptures, ceramics, canvases leaning against walls, became self-contained universes. Visitors entered not simply a residence, but a living archive of his mind. Rooms overflowed with images from different periods, as if time had folded in on itself. Past and present coexisted in stacks of drawings, painted plates, half-finished figures. Public appearances grew rarer. The art world still spoke his name with authority, but he no longer moved at its center. Exhibitions happened, interviews were requested, yet he preferred the privacy of the studio. There, routine formed a gentle structure, rising, working, pausing, returning to the canvas again. Days blurred into sequences of making. This withdrawal was not a retreat in defeat, but a narrowing of focus. Social circles shrank to a few close companions. The outside world continued its rapid change. New artistic movements, political shifts, cultural revolutions. But he engaged with them from a distance. His attention turned inward, toward the ongoing dialogue between hand, memory, and imagination. Age altered the body, but not the impulse to create. If anything, the awareness of limited time lent urgency. Works multiplied, some bold and swift, others contemplative. The studio became both sanctuary and frontier, a place where he could continue testing the possibilities of line and form without the noise of expectation. The boy who once watched the world from a window now watched it from within walls, layered with his own images. Yet observation had not ceased. It had simply changed direction, from the outer crowd to the inner archive of a life spent seeing, questioning, and reshaping reality. Here, near the sea, the circle of his public life tightened, but the quiet movement of creation went on.
Chapter 15. The Quiet After the Brush. By the early 1970s, Pablo Picasso had lived through nearly a century of upheaval, invention, and relentless creation. The world around him had changed beyond anything the boy from Málaga could have imagined. Empires had fallen. Wars had scarred continents. Art itself had been reshaped again and again. And still, in his home in the south of France, he continued to work. Age had slowed the body, but not entirely the will. His days remained oriented around the studio. Light on canvas, the familiar scent of materials, the steady rhythm of hand to surface. Yet those close to him sensed the narrowing horizon that comes not dramatically, but gradually, like evening gathering at the edge of vision. There was no grand farewell, no staged final statement. Life moved in ordinary patterns: meals, conversations, moments of quiet. The extraordinary had always lived in his work. The man himself existed within simple routines. Fame, which had long since wrapped his name in legend, did not alter the human fact of aging. The softer step, the shorter breath, the growing need for rest. On April 8, 1973, Picasso died at the age of 91. The moment itself was domestic, private, far from the noise of galleries and history books. Outside, the Mediterranean light continued as it had the day before, indifferent and gentle. For those who knew him, the loss was personal before it was historical. A presence that had filled rooms with intensity, humor, and sudden insight was gone. The hands that had moved so restlessly across paper and canvas were still. What remained in that house were not speeches or proclamations, but objects, brushes, unfinished works, the traces of a life spent in conversation with form and feeling. The boy who once studied the world in silence had reached the natural stillness that comes to all. The brush had paused, the rooms were quiet, and the long journey of one searching mind had come to its human end. Epilogue: The World After Picasso. After Picasso's death in 1973, the quiet of his studio stood in contrast to the widening resonance of his influence. What had once appeared disruptive, even unsettling, settled into the foundations of modern visual thought. The central idea behind Cubism, that reality could be analyzed, fragmented, and reconstructed rather than merely copied,
reshaped the trajectory of art in the 20th century. Movements that followed carried this shift forward in different directions. Futurism extended the breakdown of form into motion and speed. Constructivism explored structure and spatial logic. Later, abstract expressionism embraced the canvas as a field of psychological and physical action. Even artists who rejected Cubism's visual language inherited its deeper permission, the freedom to question how reality is represented at all. Museums across continents now present Picasso's works not as isolated masterpieces, but as turning points in the evolution of perception. Viewers stand before canvases that once baffled audiences and now appear as milestones, moments when painting ceased to be a window onto the world and became a way of thinking about it. His art is studied not only for aesthetic innovation, but for its philosophical implications about vision, time, and consciousness. One work in particular, Guernica, continues to stand beyond the category of art alone. It has become a universal image of civilian suffering in war, a visual lament and indictment that transcends language. A tapestry version hangs at the United Nations, where diplomacy and conflict intersect, underscoring its role as an enduring symbol of the human cost of violence. Created in response to a specific historical atrocity, the painting remains painfully relevant wherever destruction touches ordinary lives. Beyond individual works, Picasso reshaped the cultural image of the artist. He embodied the figure of the modern creator as restless, experimental, and unbound by a single identity. He moved through styles not as phases to outgrow, but as territories to explore. Reinvention became not inconsistency, but continuity of inquiry. His name has also entered popular consciousness in ways few artists achieve, invoked in everyday language as shorthand for creativity or transformation. The art market, exhibitions, and scholarship continue to circle his work, not merely preserving it, but re-examining it through new generations of eyes. Yet perhaps his most enduring legacy lies in a shift of attention. After Picasso, art could no longer assume that seeing was simple. The act of perception itself became a subject. How do we see a face, a body, a moment in time? Can a single image hold multiple perspectives, emotions, and memories at once? These questions remain active, echoing quietly each time a viewer pauses before a painting that asks them not just to look, but to think.
If this calm journey through his life brought a moment of reflection tonight, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts. Your presence helps keep these gentle explorations of history, art, and the human imagination alive.